Public Health Ground Rounds. This is a forum to engage experts and the wider public with subject expert matters on topics of public health interest. Africa CDC, as a technical public health technical organization of the African Union, aims to reach as many participants as possible to inform them, to make them aware on what's going on the continent, to stimulate a debate. And it's also an opportunity to challenge ourselves on the various topics of interest, and especially now that we have the COVID-19, and we all know how much this has really challenged livelihoods, the economy, and health. Today, we have another opportunity for the public health ground rounds. We have our moderator, Dr. Patrick Tipo, who will read us through today's ground round. Dr. Patrick Tipo has more than 30 years of experience in the vaccine manufacturing industry. He has been with the BioVac, a private-public partnership in South Africa since its inception in 2003. His responsibilities include product development, strategic alliance partnering, international relations, projects, business development, and is currently the head of science and innovation. He is focused on growing vaccine development and manufacturing in Africa, and he is a founding member of the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative. He is a strong advocate for the establishment of vaccine development and manufacturing capacity in Africa. So you see, we are in very good hands, and I will hand over to Patrick Tipor to take us through today's session. Over to you, Dr. Tipor.
Thank you, Martin. And let me just correct something. I'm Mr. Patrick Tipu, but I'm very happy to be moderating the session. And we've got a great lineup of speakers. I know that we're all aware that the African lack of vaccine manufacturing capacity on the African continent has occupied our thoughts and our energies over the last couple of months, particularly. Very pleased that we have the PAVM in place now, the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing, that has become the rallying force amongst all stakeholders to shift the needle, as they say, on the African continent. And this afternoon, certainly in Africa, it is afternoon, we're going to be focusing on COVID-19 vaccine manufacturing in Africa, particularly on the R&D side of things, R&D hubs and talent development. And we have the great pleasure of starting off with Dr. Francis Collins, who is the director at the NIH. Dr. Collins, a warm welcome. I think people know you well, so I'm going to take the liberty of not covering your bio before we introduce you. But I'll hand over to you to make a few opening remarks, and then we'll proceed with some discussion. And unfortunately to the audience, Dr. Collins needs to leave immediately after he delivers his presentation on research and development hubs and talent development. Over to you, Dr. Collins. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. And it's a pleasure to be able to speak to this distinguished group. I see 151 participants have currently signed on, and wonderful to be able to reach out from where I am here in morning time in the United States to many of you in afternoon in Africa. I want to recognize the other panel members who will follow after me as also distinguished leaders that I hope you will listen to, because I think they'll have a lot of good points to make. Also want to recognize Roger Glass, who is the director at NIH of the Fogarty International Center, which is our main focus on global health. And he's also linked up and will stay with this whole program in case questions come up about NIH he might be able to address after I have to scoot off to another responsibility. Just want to say the African CDC and the African Union have been outstanding in the way in which you have been mobilizing countries of Africa to respond in a bold way to the COVID-19 pandemic, the worst pandemic in more than a century. The surveillance, the organization of stakeholders, including many presidents of countries, and laying out actionable plans has been impressive. And the need for that kind of leadership is great and will continue to be. I am deeply committed to global health research on the part of NIH, and I'm happy to help out as a member of the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing, PAVM. But the pandemic has also highlighted the almost total dependence of African countries on purchasing vaccines from abroad, and we have seen how inequitable this system has been. The situation will improve markedly in the coming year as the major producers are ramping up production. Although right now it looks as if there's a terrible inequity present. I'm particularly delighted to see members of this panel are each trying to correct this by engaging in various ways to manufacture vaccines on an accelerated basis. But we also have to think about future needs. This will not be the last time that we will need vaccines at scale across the whole world. And we must not, in the next demand for this, simply settle for what we have at the present time. The good news about vaccines for COVID-19 has been how successful they have been, whether it's the messenger RNA platform, viral vector vaccines, purified spike protein subunit with appropriate ways of administering, or live or attenuated viruses. All of these seem to work in various ways that are debated in terms of their precise efficacy and safety, but it is scientifically a good position to be in to know that we do have science that can work here. But how do we figure out how to enable a more equitable distribution of vaccine manufacturing, and especially on the continent of Africa? How do we do this? I think that's already heavily underway in places like South Africa. Must begin with fill and finish to build the infrastructure and the human resources to work with these unique products. But what we really want to see is tech transfer from companies to learn while engaging. And we need training so that real innovation and vaccine research can come from African investigators working in this field. We at NIH have been speaking with a number of vaccine manufacturers to encourage them to share their technology and their expertise to assist in establishment of capacity in Africa. And several of them have stated their commitments, which is comforting since this is an industry where many steps in manufacturing are developed in-house and not in the public domain. So you need that willing participation in order to make this kind of transfer of capabilities occur. That means, by the way, that it's probably not a good idea to demonize the companies because you're going to need their help in order to set up effective manufacturing capabilities. I will say it's been variable. Some companies are more enthusiastic about helping out. Others are maybe a little skeptical and concerned that it will be quicker to produce more vaccine in the North and just take advantage of their economies of scale and not try to do something in terms of spreading manufacturing capabilities around. We think it's got to be both and, that, yeah, you need more manufacturing in the places that are already having that capability, scale it up. But we also must see ways in which this can spread to other parts of the world, and especially to Africa. So we applaud the African CDC and the AU with their plans to try to support and build this ecosystem over the next 20 years. And we applaud this goal of being able to manufacture 60% of the vaccine needs for Africa in the African continent. And of course, a big part of that is going to be standing up the African Medicines Agency. This is going to require a lot of coordination and collaboration, both training and manufacturing methods, researchers to consider other key infections where innovations in manufacture and inclusion of new infectious agents would further improve the health of Africans and the many visitors to the continent. So NIH is happy to be a partner in this vision, and we are happy to help through our many grants mechanisms, our active participation in engaging with manufacturers, our support for researchers and partnerships that can develop the research enterprise. My participation here today represents that commitment and the commitment of NIH to do everything we can to help achieve these goals of manufacturing current and new vaccines on the continent over the upcoming 20 years so that Africa can become self-sufficient in many vaccines and innovate with others that otherwise wouldn't get the attention they deserve. So I wanted to just spend a few minutes joining you today to convey that message, even though because of other constraints, I won't be able to stay for the whole time. But glad for the chance to say those few words. And thank you, Patrick, for moderating this panel. And I now will be glad to answer a few questions before I have to disappear for other duties.
Thank you so much, Dr. Collins. And I think what you harped on is the inequity. And I think the fact that you, on behalf of NIH, are committed to working together with key players on the African continent to address this dilemma that we're in and build capacity. And we know that NIH has an excellent track record and a rich history when it comes to vaccine development. And so we look forward to those relationships and partnerships. But perhaps just before we take leave of you, a couple of thoughts around perhaps possibly two key issues. The one is funding. You know, it all starts with money. We have all these great ideas, etc., goodwill, but we need some fuel in the tank to get it going. And thoughts on how we as a global community and also as an African community could mobilize resources towards funding R&D, and what sort of policy interventions should we be thinking of?
Well, that's the appropriate question to move all of this effort forward. 4 years ago at the World Economic Forum in Davos, I and some other African leaders proposed an initiative called CARI, the Coalition for African Research and Innovation. Lots of support for the idea that a time has come to have across the continent and with support from African leaders of countries, an effort to really build research capacity on the continent. We didn't know that COVID-19 was coming at that point, but we certainly had many other health needs that could be better addressed if there was this kind of network capability. I think the concept has been widely embraced, but the implementation sort of hasn't quite happened. It would be a way to bring together sources of funding support. Some of it certainly from outside the continent. Some of it, frankly, could be better organized within the continent. I would love to see leaders of African countries appreciating the way in which this kind of investment is both good for health and good for the economy, making that a priority. We, for too long, have had research on the African continent basically driven by sources of funding from outside. It's been kind of a colonial model. And as I guess I coined the term, we need to go from donorship to ownership, where African countries and their leaders embrace this as a priority. We're glad to help with that. But I don't want to continue the model where somehow all the decisions are being made by priorities from outside the continent, because they come and they go and they may not be well matched with what's needed. COVID-19 brings this all into a very sharp focus. If we had something like that now, I know it would be very useful in putting together a plan for funding. Industry, by the way, is very much taken by the idea of such a organization such as CARI, and would be probably also willing to be a vigorous partner in terms of resources and expertise, and philanthropy likewise. And there's certainly interest in places like the World Bank in helping to make this happen, or the African Development Bank. All those conversations have happened, but it hasn't quite crystallized. And we need a business plan, and then we need really vigorous buy-in from presidents of African countries to say this is a priority. So I'm going to take a moment here to just push that idea. I think the time is right. The focus that we now have seen, the need for this, has been more compelling than ever. The African Medicines Agency coming along is another critical part of the solution. We got to do this.
Excellent. Mentioning the African Medicines Agency takes us into this element of regulatory capacity, regulatory capability, and the essential enabling role that that would play to support vaccine R&D and vaccine manufacture on the continent. Over and above what we understand that AMA is going to achieve, Are there any other considerations or ideas or words of advice that you would offer us on the continent with respect to governing bodies, regulatory changes that would enable the ramping up on of vaccine R&D on the continent?
Well, I think the African CDC is a wonderful example which has embraced this opportunity and this responsibility. I'm quite optimistic with that kind of motivation, with the African Union's role and with the advance of the African Medicines Agency. The pieces are kind of coming together. Again, I think what's really needed is going to be a very strong embrace of leaders of countries to see this not as just a nice thing to have, but essential going forward. We've been, I think, hearing a lot of enthusiasm from that. Roger Glass, who's now, I see, joined me, and I have been particularly talking with leaders in Senegal, for instance, and you're going to hear from Amadou Sall here shortly about the potential there of trying to turn this kind of circumstance into a real opportunity, both for economics and for health. So if we could build on that, on this sort of silver lining of a very dark cloud, which is COVID-19, to provide the motivation to really build that transcontinental determination to make something happen, then we'd be getting somewhere. We have other foundations to build on. You know, NIH, together with the Wellcome Trust, has funded now for almost 10 years something called H3 Africa, Human Health and Heredity in Africa, which has built capacity in genomics across quite a number of countries, linked them up with each other, built strength in their university research institutions, which are crucial for the future. And so we have now, I think, as a result of that, come up with a way in which better training capabilities are there. The brain drain has been somewhat reversed, but that's just a start. But Africa is rising, and this ought to be the moment to really build on that momentum. And I regret I'm going to have to jump off now, Patrick. I'm sorry, this is really awful. I got to basically say a whole lot of things and not to answer a lot of questions, but that's the nature of my life, I'm afraid. But I'm really glad I was able to join you briefly. And again, Dr. Glass is here and can continue, since he and I kind of joined at the hip when it comes to the approach of what we're talking about at this Grand Rounds.
Excellent. Dr. Collins, thank you so much for your contribution. Thank you so much for your time and for your partnership and support as well. And we'll leave Dr. Glass to answer all the difficult questions later.
Good plan. Good luck, Roger. All right. Bye, everybody.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, we had to get out of the starting blocks quite quickly initially because Dr. Collins had to leave. So let me double back a little bit and just orientate us as an audience to the run of this webinar this afternoon. So we've had Dr. Collins started with some of his remarks from the perspective personally and from the perspective of the NIH. The other topics that we're going to be covering today would be the role of the research institutions in development of support to research hubs. The second or the third topic is internship and training in the vaccine arena. And the fourth topic is market shaping and market access in global vaccines market. And we've got an extremely eloquent panel of speakers with a wealth of experience behind them to take us through these topics. Dr. Hiba Wali, the CEO of Vaxera. Hiba, I must just alert you that we've changed the order of things a little bit because Dr. Sol has to excuse himself because of emergencies as well. So the next up is going to be Dr. Sol. Then we're going to deal with your topic, Dr. Wali. And then we'll move on to Professor Padmashri Sampath. Hi, Padmashri, nice to see you again. And who will be taking us through market shaping and market access. Let me advise you as the audience that if you have any questions, to please post them in the Q&A function and not the chat box. It just makes it easier to track and trace and follow the questions, and hopefully I can get around to asking the presenters the appropriate questions as you post them there. So without further ado then, Dr. Saul, it is over to you. We are in your capable hands to talk about, I believe, if I have this right, internships or apprenticeship programs in the vaccine arena. And from the experience of the Institute Pasteur in Dakar, who boasts as the manufacturer of the only WHO pre-qualified product on the continent. Welcome, and we look forward to learning from your experiences.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And first of all, really want to actually emphasize the need of such a kind of webinar and more exchange. And I really also want to say a great congratulations of the CDC for putting this effort when it comes to vaccine manufacturing. As Dr. Collins really emphasized, that this is the time now, and this is a good opportunity to have African being master of their destiny when it comes to vaccine. Now, coming to the topic that you assigned me about program to train people in general, if I can summarize it that way for Institute Pasteur in Dakar, I want to make a couple of initial comments. Number one is that we have this great opportunity about understanding a little bit better that area, because we have been from the beginning involved into doing a vaccine from end to end. And this gives us an opportunity really to look at fill and finish, to look at really making the drug substance, but also being confronted with all the environment that you need besides having actually the process to manufacture. And this has been a great opportunity in terms of making sure you get the right human resource, because even though I see people are focusing very much when it comes to vaccine manufacturing about equipment, about actually regulatory environment, enabling environment. If you look very carefully, it's a lot about human resource, because it's about making a product safe by using procedure and applying them on a very systematic way. So the human resource is really a strong pillar of all this. And we have all to be conscious of that. And this is really coming out from the experience that we have. When I talk about human resource, in our experience, let me come to the four main lessons that we learned. Number one, we learned that it's about a very large diversity of skills that people need to have. It means that when we talk about manufacturing, we're talking actually about regulatory, we're talking about quality assessment, we're talking about quality control, and we're talking also about manufacturing per se, all the process, the bioprocessing. And the way actually we are tackling this is usually when people come to have an idea about this diversity, we love in terms of experience and in terms of training people coming to really make sure that they have an idea about how all the situation, the diversity of the situation that need to be put together to make a vaccine product something that people can use. And one thing is really to make sure they seize this diversity by having some time spent into the different sort of department where they can learn a little bit what quality assessment is about, where they can learn what quality assurance is about, how regulatory work, and this sort of thing. And then we need to have some sort of basic training where people understand better what is a good manufacturing practice is. And having that in place, give an idea about how diverse is the situation and what is really actually the level of complexity to link all this together. And because unless you sense that, you don't really understand how all this links. So bringing to people this opportunity to have that and have a cross-sectional view of that is, for me, very important to see this diversity. The other thing which is also important, this diversity, even though it exists, needs some sort of specialization, meaning that when people have to do quality assurance or quality control, they need really to master methods. but making sure that when they do it in a way that is consistent over time. And that's what people are looking at when they come for inspection, for pre-qualification or all these sort of things. So it's a lot about making sure each part is very well specialized. So when we talk about training program for those people, the training program usually would have a theoretical aspect where you seize this diversity, and then you go to a more specialized with practical hands-on experience. And that is the first point I wanted to make about our experience. The diversity of the skills that need to be mastered is important. The second thing is about the curriculum. When we talk about the curriculum, we're talking here about trying to get someone from a level of expertise to understand a culture and be part of that culture when you come to train, and make sure that when people are working in vaccine manufacturing, they're not just applying procedure, but they have all this culture about working together and make sure on the way they contribute, this is impacting the end product. It's not just something that is isolated and separated. And to have this curriculum, obviously theory is very important, but practical is the more important things. And we have to go through incremental process where people learn things, master them theoretically, look at people watching before going into the operation progressively. And that way we have realized, first, it takes time. It's very much dependent on early experience. And it also need actually to find a way where you have an internal continuing education process by which people can learn from the people more experienced. So in terms of curriculum and comment, I think this is one of the major lessons that we learned. The third part of the intervention about building this program for training is really, for me, the collaboration. It's absolutely important to have a collaboration happening. And in this regards, this collaboration, we want to really make sure that you bring people like the academics, because understanding the need upfront would be actually go where people train operators, where they train engineers, or they train leaders, and make sure in the curriculum, you build some sort of partnership so people can arrive with much better preparations. When I talk about collaboration, I have in mind National Regulatory Authority. It is very important that they teach people on the way that how they look at the facilities and what they are looking for when they come for inspection, on how they support the regulatory environment. And it's about collaborating with WHO that have all the standards, and just make sure through the training they can provide and through the different interaction they can provide. This is an important asset. I'm just talking about the few stakeholders that are important, but this is something definitely important that people need to understand. The collaborative approach when we do these training and in general make a lot of sense and would help actually the whole process. And the last point I wanted to make is that what do we do out of this experience? We really thought about it in the light of COVID, say, okay, within the framework of this partnership, it's important that all this experience and the experience that have at BioVac, that have from Vactera, and all these different experience, we need to build something together. And we came with a concept of trying to build some biomanufacturing curriculum training where people would come based on their experience to learn specifically through workshop and or have a much long-term like curriculum to be able to be trained properly where they can serve the African need. And this is something we've been working as part of our project, and for which we build a center that we call CARE, which is meaning Center for Africa Resilience to Epidemic. And within that center, our main idea is to have different set of training, but particularly in the field of biomanufacturing, where we think that if we look at the need in the coming year, this is going to be something extremely important. And this is something where we need manufacturer, the different manufacturer, but also the one outside of Africa, try to help and build the workforce that we're all going to be needing to make the promise that Africa CDC is trying to reach, meaning 60% of the vaccine by 2040. Patrick, I'll stop there and take any questions if you want. Sorry about that if I've been a bit too long. Thanks.
No. Thanks, Amadeo, and I think that your contribution is flavored by the experience that that you have had at IPD, and specifically on the ground with respect to building capacity, that it doesn't take overnight. So thanks for those thoughts. perhaps just to probe a little bit in terms of your thinking with respect to the need for training, the need for developing a workforce. You spoke about diversities, specialization, focus on curricula, collaboration, etc. But where do you think the opportunities lie best? You know, the term that we like to use is low-hanging fruit. Are these through apprenticeships? Do we need, what are the programs? How do we tap into big pharma maybe for some support and assistance? Any thought around those issues?
Yes, actually, I think where we really need, what I see really, I see two major, in general, we just do not have enough people to do that. Whether we're talking about operator or we're talking about leads or we're talking about heads, we do not have enough people that have this right skill to make it happen. So rather than trying to tackle everything at the same time, we need to prioritize. And I believe in our experience that the operator, the people that we can be trained out of university can go through a process is something that can be fixed locally. But really, if you want to bring some heads of or head or lead, we may have to tap into the diaspora. And that's where actually we would need to build with them and some sort of very good curriculum and make sure that we have internal program that people can use and be able actually to deliver actually the needs. Now, in this regard, I see a very specific role that big pharma can provide into really helping developing and scaling up manufacturing Africa. Because if you look what happened in India, for instance, a couple of years ago, they really developed all these program on training that has been extremely helpful to build the whole system. And in this regard, the manufacturer themselves should be actually supporting training program, building them. And that's where I was saying that the cooperation between different companies, different manufacturing in Africa can be extremely instrumental for that. The second important gap and role I can see is what university can do as a center, as a place where people learn and where people get information and get some training, is really to make sure each of these different institutions, we find a way actually where some good program in the field of biomanufacturing are being done and done in cooperation with really what the market needs. And one of the key things in this regard is really obviously funding. We need to make sure that to fill that gap, we have enough funding going through these channels and make sure that people can get access to the training much better. Because today, let's face it, if you want to train people at a level that is meaningful, this costs a lot of money and this costs some level of equipment that do not necessarily exist in our actually university. So these are like the two different points I wanted to make, Patrick, based on your question. Over to you.
Okay, there are a number of other questions coming up in the Q&A, but I do understand that you have to excuse yourself soon. But maybe, Amado, in terms of your understanding of what, because you spoke about the diversity of skills that is required, and that the diversity of skills is not only relative to that which is required for manufacturing. There are different stages of research and development as well, and those also require different skill sets. And to what extent do you think that maybe in Senegal specifically, but also more generally on the African continent, are our universities, are schools and universities geared up sufficiently to provide, call it the raw talent into the system for that further training and development to take place? Are there gaps, and how do you think we need to plug those gaps?
Yeah, I think definitely we do not have enough university doing that. That's the fact. But when it comes also to apprentice, I think we should also leverage all this vocational education, because obviously when we talk about vaccine manufacturing, we need some level of operator where this vocational education institution can be extremely relevant. If I take the example of Senegal, they create some years ago what they call ISAP, which is more like taking people between end of the high school and early of the beginning of college. And some of them can be extremely well trained to do some work as an operator and doing it extremely well, even though we're not talking about master or PhD or bachelor. This sort of level is where we can probably tap in and make sure that we get the right crowd that we need. And also, I think it's important that most of the time we think a lot about what's going to make the vaccine in terms of technology, enabling environment, but we need also support system. When I say support, we're talking about packaging, we're talking about delivery, we're talking about maintenance, and all these sort of capacities and skill can be somehow solved through these other area than really the university per se. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Amadou. Let's move on. I see the clock ticking away steadily, but thanks for that contribution. And if you're still around later, there might be one or two more questions. But let me move across to Dr. Hiba Wali, the CEO of Axera. Hiba, welcome. Good to see you again, and we look forward to your remarks on the role of research institutions in the development and support of research hubs. Over to you, Hiba.
Hello, Thibaut, and thank you very much for your invitation. I would like firstly to thank Africa CDC and African Union for such giving an opportunity to participate in such a big event. It's an honor for us to be part of this event. Actually, Patrick, we talk in a very important subject now, which is the R&D. The R&D is the backbone for any vaccine because it's at the early stage, and we learn very well from the COVID pandemic that we should have a very strong R&D to work quickly to establish a vaccine in order to face such a pandemic. But it's very important to empower the university, which this is, we need the topic to discuss. We need to empower the universities to be involved in the R&D, not to be away from the industry. So the applied R&D is very important in the field of the vaccine production. For the university, we need to encourage all the academic people that they work in the field of research related to the vaccine to be in cooperation with the manufacturer for such kind of thoughts. They start with thoughts for the vaccine, and then they start to develop on a bench scale, and then we come up to applied R&D. So it is a big challenge for the industry. And I think we should all work on the empowerment of the university to be part of that. Sometimes we had a challenge for the universities in the infrastructure for R&D to have an ideal research and development unit. So they face such a problem for the infrastructure, and we should have in place what is the ideal R&D facility to enhance all the participants to be part of the industry itself. And I think this is covering the empowerment of R&D from the university. I'll move to the second point, which is related to the infrastructure for the vaccine manufacturing facility. If I have a vaccine in the pipeline, what infrastructure should I prepare for the production of the vaccine? But I should, before go to such a step, I should had a question, and we prepare the answer for that. What type of vaccine we are looking for? What type of technology we are need to be added to the portfolio? What side of the market it is to satisfy the local need, or we are working for expansion outside? So I had a lot of questions in order to determine the type of human and non-human resource. We need also to think about what kind of facility we need to have. So it takes a long time, and we all should put it firstly in what is called conceptual design. So it's a very important step for any facility to be built, the conceptual design for the facility, which we put the concept we all agreed upon. So it consider the type of technology, it's consider the number of doses we are aim to have. And also at this step, we should work very close with the regulatory authorities in the country to have initial approval on what we are going to do. And then after making the conceptual design, we should go to the basic and detailed one, coming up with a validation master plan that we are need to have. So it's a long story, and from our experience, if this step is not controlled well, so it by the end it can have a nightmare in the project. So we have not identified well what we need, what is the expectation. We cannot able to make verification of. So this is the most important point should cover if we are gonna to talk about the production facility for the vaccine and what we need for that. The consideration and the challenge which we are gonna to face for the vaccine industry, it is a very sensitive industry, and we should take care of if we have a challenge. So maybe for touch a point, the challenge for the vaccine industry, if we are thinking to have a facility for the production, so we should carefully calculate the initial investment needed for the project, the operational cost, the project duration. All the people in all the countries during the pandemic for COVID, they dream to have a facility for the production of the vaccine, and they think that by tomorrow we are going to have a facility for the production, and it is not coming true, because for building a facility for the production of the vaccine, it takes a long time, and to validate the system is also need more time. So this is one of the most challenging if we are thinking to have a facility for the production. Also, as mentioned, that the have trained personnel, it is also a big challenge, and they know exactly about the industry, about the know-how itself. It is an art that we don't know how. We don't have a lot of people have the experience concerning the technology transfer and know-how for the production of different type of the vaccine. So we should be very careful in that. And this is one of the most challenge that also facing the vaccine industry. And all which I mentioned should be putting into consideration when we think to have a facility for a production of the vaccine. And coming by the end, if we talk about across the content, the vaccine. So to think about having the hub, we should make collection for the data around the places and make analyzing to what they have from infrastructure, from personnel, from experience, and so on. And then we should also have a place which have a stronger regulatory authority, which by the end can evaluate what we have for R&D. So we meet the requirement for them in order to make it an applied R&D. And by the end, if we need to market the product in the country, it should be approved by the regulatory authority. So this is my quick overview coming from our experience in the vaccine industry about the applied R&D, the basic design. If we are thinking to have a facility for the production, the challenge which we may face, and for the hub, if we need to choose a hub for R&D in the continent. So we have a basic requirement should be in place in advance. Thank you very much. And if you have any question, I'm here.
Thank you, Dr. Wally. We'll take some questions later from the Q&A box, and I would advise people who are posting questions, if you are targeting a certain panelist, to put that panelist's name in there, it just makes my job so much easier to then direct that question to one or more of the panelists. Dr. Wally, before we move on, maybe just to examine some of your thoughts around the connection between the hubs. So let me ask the first question. Do you think we need a hub in Africa, or do you think we need more than one research hub in Africa?
For this point, because in Africa we have a very special case, because the experience related to the vaccine industry is very limited, because we don't have a lot of manufacturer of the vaccine in the continent. So I think if we have a hub and we can all share the information together in such a hub, and it covers a different number of countries, and we can make share of information together. So I think it will be a good idea to have a hub. This is because we still all the country in the continent, we cannot find a lot of experience related to the vaccine industry. So I prefer, from my point of view, to have a hub.
So and then how would this hub relate to how would it need to position itself in the ecosystem? And obviously the end game is the production of commercial product to ensure that product is made available, relevant product that is made available timeously and also affordably, and that has a connection with the manufacturers. And I know I'm putting you on the spot somewhat here, but any thoughts around the relationship between the hub and the current vaccine manufacturers on the continent, because they're dispersed, and also aspiring vaccine manufacturers on the continent. What thoughts do you have to share with us, or advice, considerations that you might have?
Let me back to your first question relating to how can those hub, or if it is one or more, how it is collaborate with the manufacturer of the vaccine. I think, my dear, in R&D, we have R&D and applied R&D. So we have the bench scale, and then how we make the scale up to the production level. So I think in the hub, we are gonna firstly to work on bench scale to have the idea in place, and then we make scale up to the production level. So it make it much easier for the manufacturer to take such technology and it is approved. So we can go and proceed, because the trial has been conducted in the hub, and they can give the know-how for the manufacturer to start work in the scale up for the production level. So this is the relation. How can we make the relation between the hub R&D and the manufacturer? It's not limited to give them the technology. It will after that we had the training for the personnel on the know-how, and we had a lot of aspects related to the relation between the hub for R&D and the manufacturer, and we should highlight, we should have a stronger R&D in between to approve, if we can say that we have such a technology and we start, for example, preclinical. If the country don't have a stronger R&D, so who can judge on the preclinical study? So this is one of the most important points need to be highlighted, the relation between R&D or the hub to do the R&D and the manufacturer. Maybe we can also use the hub to sell the know-how. Maybe it's sometimes we can give the idea, give the know-how, and we can sell to the producer to start work on that.
Dr. Wally, thanks so much for your input and contribution. And we wish you and Vaxera very well. I know that there's a lot of activity happening in Egypt at the moment with respect to COVID-19 vaccine development and manufacture, but also other vaccines as well. But there may be some more questions that we'll circle back to you with later. So let me move on to to Prof. Padmashri Sampath. Hi, Padmashri. Good to be talking to you again. And very keen to hear what thoughts you have to share with us this afternoon on market shaping and market access in the global vaccines market. Because in my opinion, if I can be totally transparent, I think this is the make or break of building vaccine manufacturing capacity on the African continent. Over to you, Padmashri.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you. And yeah, I would agree with you totally. Absolutely. Yes, I think it's a make or break issue. I have a slide deck. Would it be possible to share slides?
I'm sure it should be possible.
Oh, yes, yes. I'm able to do that. So so this is a recent study that I've just completed, and we've just published it for the German International Corporation, as part of the German International Corporation for the GIZ, funded by the German Ministry for Development Cooperation. So basically, you know, I mean, as part of the study, one of the things that I did was to look at where we stand in market shaping up until now, and what have been these successes, and how can we use those to sort of like inform us in shaping markets for Africa now, and use that to enhance production capacity. So one of the things is, I mean, the study does is takes a sort of a deep dive at Gavi's past market shaping experience, and to look at how Gavi has succeeded actually in expanding the market and increasing the number of suppliers over the past 20 years. And in this slide, I'm just going to summarize those things. But Gavi has really sort of opened up from the time it started the question of creating structured markets by offering up a really structured negotiation space between big pharma and who could then supply to low and middle income countries, but also allowed a really new suppliers to enter the market who were actually able to do so because of the pool demand, forecasted markets, and other financial enablers that Gavi really provided. But in the past, we were operating in an entirely different context because it was not a situation of simultaneous global entry of products. So what we were trying to do through Gavi's market shaping experience is really sort of, we had a set of products that were available in the high income countries, and we wanted basically to move them and to see how we could expand our supply to low and middle income countries. So we were either trying to tier price and allow you know, a different kind of pricing to increase accessibility in low and middle income countries, or trying to facilitate new suppliers from the developing country markets. And the Gavi's had multiple successes. I mean, no doubt in that. So there's been a new and steady entry of vaccines in low and middle income countries. In this study, I mean, there's a sort of detailed data analysis, which shows that we've had at least 10 new vaccines since 2009. We've had a sort of a meeting point between public health and private sector interests, because tiered pricing has really allowed for greater access to markets for firms on the one hand, and also allowed for lower prices. A good example is the human papillomavirus vaccine. And we've had lower prices and better market structure, especially for pentavalent and rotavirus, which stand out as key successes. But we've also had price reductions by introducing new suppliers in a whole range of segments: yellow fever, inactivated polio vaccine, typhoid with Bharat Biotech, and so on. So if you take the aggregate look, I mean, it changed the global market in terms of value and volume significantly, splitting it up in terms of value in high income countries and volume in terms of supplies through Gavi to low and middle income countries. So we see actually over the last 20 years, if you take the market by the volume only, the emergence of 7 developing country manufacturers as significant suppliers on a global scale. And this market split is built on a different business model where a lot of companies you know, compete on economies of scale. But in key categories, if you look into specific vaccine categories, you see that product entry and pricing has this sort of complex interactions, and there are key factors that led to the success of a lot of the new entrants to come into the market. One of them is technology transfer and push funding, which you see in the case of vaccines, like especially pentavalent, Hep B. There's a lot of local market dynamics that support firms from developing countries to emerge, particularly large markets in India, and support from the state in the case of biopharma in Indonesia. Then you also see that the introduction of vaccines into vaccine protocols gives a lot of scope for new vaccines to manufacturers to enter. And then, but the question is, has market shaping ensured companies to stay in the market when they enter the market? And how effective have we been until now in making companies stay in the market? It's a totally different question after we say, okay, how many companies have entered in the market? And one of the things we find there is that there's sort of a push towards, bringing down the prices and expanding the markets. And this usually, because of the structure of the vaccines market itself and the sector dynamics, which really calls for large economies of scale and scope to bring down the price, usually ends up creating sort of a few winners. A lot of firms exit, so there's a lot of attrition. This is a pentavalent vaccine example between 2007 and 2021. So you see that the market splits differently over time. So what now? So what are the lessons and where do we go from here? In the study, sort of like we identify a couple of of course, there's a huge opportunity now, which everybody's focusing on, which is that African markets are big. They will account for a large share of the demand. COVID-19 is going to allow us to really supply and probably also expand the entire vaccine value chain in terms of market shaping. But we also have a number of challenges, which the study identifies as key challenges we really need to deal with in the future to strengthen market shaping. One of the things that, so this is the expanded market access, of course. Currently, Gavi is procuring for 56 eligible countries, but the prices negotiated by Gavi are really useful because they are also negotiated for countries that have transitioned out of Gavi. And Gavi has a total funding of about 1 billion per annum, which gives Gavi a good basis to negotiate prices which are significantly cheaper than countries would negotiate independently. Of the challenges we need to face, and I think this is very important for the question you really asked about what can it do to strengthen African manufacturing? The market just tends towards first mover advantages, especially in the presence of R&D. So we really have to be careful about it. One of the key things that we saw, for instance, is that Sanofi dropped out of the mRNA vaccine research because the market's already split between, Moderna and Pfizer BioNTech. You see Clover entering, but there's a huge domestic market for Clover to rely on, which brings into focus the relevance of domestic markets and regional procurement mechanisms in Africa. There's also difficulties in aligning price and vaccine value of new COVID-19 vaccines, because from a market shaping perspective, we operate as though all vaccines are perfect substitutes, but that's not necessarily a case from an epidemiological perspective. Different vaccines have different characteristics, and we need to take those into account. Third thing is really sort of like trying to streamline and coordinate local production and supply expansion. So this is a graph that comes from a different study that I did, but it's relevant here. So we currently have, if you take the projections until end of 2022, it looks like we have enough supply to sort of get us there. And we don't know what the steady state demand is going to be beyond 2022 for COVID-19 vaccines. And if you really want to have the entry of new players, one of the things that we really know from Gavi's market shaping experience is that we need to be able to ensure demand. We need to be able to forecast and give producers some sort of guarantee. Otherwise, it increases the economic risks. And then currently we have a wide variety of actors sending parallel signals, which actually also increases the political risks as to how the procurement processes are going to take place. So we really have to start thinking on those terms, how to sort of like really give better guarantees and signal to producers in a better way what's going to happen. And then dealing with, tiered pricing, we all know that it has a lot of different problems. So we need to really start thinking about, if we're going to introduce new products globally, is tiered pricing the best way to go? How do we make sure tier pricing does not negatively influence product entry in certain markets, because it might interfere with international reference prices and so on and so forth. So then the other thing is also, how do we link market shaping to new business models? Like, when a big pharma wants to do more R&D or tech transfer on the continent, can we have different kinds of market shaping? And how do you incorporate the cost of doing business in Africa for local firms to enter the market? And how are we going to do that through buyback guarantees at the national or the regional level? So that's some of the stuff that we haven't discussed. And in this study, sort of like I go much deeper into sort of raising those questions and suggesting some solutions, which I won't go into here. So we need really moving forward a much more open discussion really on whether we are really ready to assess and change the market, and how we're going to balance public health with production, supply, and innovation much better and more closely than we've done until now, and clearly sort of benchmark the market, possibly by segments in the future, and try to really facilitate the entry of new firms. Because if we want to do what we did in the last 20 years, we probably need to bring in a new cohort of producers from the developing world, potentially from Africa, and we need to target that much more. So with that, I'm gonna stop. So.
Thank you very much, Padmasree. I know that was a whirlwind tour through some very, very detailed work and analysis that you and your team have done. But I think what emerges out of this is the complexity of the issues that one has to wrestle with. And if there were a starting point, a simple starting point, what would your advice be to the PAVM or the African Union or the African CDC who's leading the charge at the moment? Where do we start with wrestling? What is the first bite of this elephant that we need to take?
Patrick, I'd say that, I mean, I think it's great that we're investing into technological upgrading and industrial upgrading and so on. But I think that without market security, it's not going to work, because we need to know where we're going to sell and how we're going to sell and what's going to happen to the products. So for me, the starting point would be to bring the technology discussion and the finance of working capital and, different actors together with where are the markets and where are we going to supply, and, how are we going to potentially enter those markets, whether we do that through Gavi, whether we're going to do that, at the regional level, and what's the interface between these things.
Okay. I see a question that has popped up in the Q&A is, so why is Africa such a challenge when it comes to the market? What is so unique about the market in Africa?
So I think, currently large parts of the African market are catered to, the vaccine market, strictly speaking, is catered to by Gavi supplies, right? And this has worked well. Now we face a real conundrum. So if we take that out, we're going to weaken Gavi's capacity to negotiate better prices and introduce supply through COVAX as well. So you're going to be balkanizing procurement mechanisms in a certain way if you take that market out, and you're not going to ensure that there's good coordination and good structure, and Gavi's capacity remains sort of somehow compensated to market ship along with African regional agencies. So this is the thing that we probably need to really work toward, that we want to have a market which is actually somehow also catering to African local producers and African interests, but how do we work within the present contours to say that we retain all the good and then we expand on the things we need?
You make it sound so easy.
Yes, not so easy, yes.
Yeah. Okay. I've got this daunting task now of sifting through some of the questions and highlighting them. So, Dr. Glass, I wonder if you also have access to the Q&A. Are you able to access the Q&A as well? There was a question. Excellent. So there was a question for Dr. Collins early on in the conversation, and if you could take a read of that and indicate whether you're in a position to respond to it. Just wave your hand at me later, then I'll circle back to you. But let me take one or two other questions there. Does anybody have any insights or inputs, thoughts regarding the recent announcement of Moderna about planning to build a vaccine plant in Africa? Padmasree, maybe you have some thoughts about what will this do to the market and the market shaping, but any of the other panelists as well with respect to how this might add to or enhance what we're trying to do on the African continent?
Okay, so I'll go quickly. I think that the devil is in the details. I think I want to hear a little bit more about how this plant will be built, what it entails, and how that's going to actually help secure greater supplies for Africa, tech transfers. They're going to be know-how. I also think that to increase the supply situation and to, in a way, somehow to expand on the supply and to increase local production capacity, and this is something that I explore in the study, we might want to start thinking about price incentives to African producers, or could we actually just say, this is a portion of the procurement that we're going to try and accommodate from African producers? How can we do these? Of course, there are the good and the bad of all these instruments. You have to benchmark the price in a different way. You'll have to make sure it remains competitive over time and so on. But how can we devise these? How can we sort of like start a conversation for devising these things is something that's in the study, and I think that will be useful to discuss that in the context of the Moderna plant, also in the context of new plants that are being set up, and more generally as well.
Thank you. We have another question here, and this is posed to anybody who might want to venture an answer. So there's a whole lot of focus on COVID-19, and let's assume that in the short term we do get there as an African continent in terms of having significant capacity with respect to the production of COVID-19 vaccines. The question then is, how difficult a task is it to produce other vaccines after having this, let's call it scaled up capacity for the production of COVID-19 vaccine? And Dr. Glass, Dr. Wally, Padmasree, whoever wants to chirp in here, please add your pennies worth. Dr. Wally, can I put you on the spot for a first attempt at that answer? How difficult is it to make other vaccines if you've got the capacity to make COVID-19 vaccines, once you have the capacity to make COVID-19 vaccines?
Sorry, Patrick, I have interruption in the connection. Could you please repeat your question?
The question is, how difficult is it to produce other vaccines as well once one has the capacity to produce COVID-19 vaccines?
Hello?
Eva, did you get the question?
Hello, Patrick?
Yes. Did you hear the
Please,
question?
could you repeat it again?
Okay, I'll try one more time. I'll try one more time, and then Dr. Glass, maybe you could have an attempt at
Sure.
it, but let's Dr. Wally another chance. How difficult is it to produce other vaccines once the capacity of a COVID-19 vaccine has been established in a country? Dr. Wally, I think we have a problem with the connection. Dr. Glass, do you mind
Sure.
stepping in?
Sure. Very good question. I've been impressed, as Dr. Collins mentioned, that there have been 4 platforms that have been used for these vaccines for COVID. Two of the platforms, the mRNA and the viral vector platforms, have never been used before. Before this outbreak, we didn't know if these two platforms would work. So that's been a terrific surprise. We never would have anticipated. The other platforms for expressed proteins, expressed antigens in baculovirus or in yeast, or for live or attenuated vaccines have been around. So I was most impressed. I've worked in India for a long time on rotavirus. I was very impressed that Bharat Biotech, that 20 years ago had never made a vaccine, now in 20 years has made about 7 new vaccines, but they had the first COVID vaccine in India, not with mRNA, but with the old-fashioned killed viral vaccine that's been effective in India. And they could retool and build that on a platform of virus cultivation. So I think that it's the platforms that are changing. What's been most interesting in this pandemic is that the mRNA platform is totally different. It's a chemical platform instead of a viral culture platform. So it doesn't require using cell cultures and adventitious agents and a lot of that testing. It just requires what's required for drugs, which is much simpler. Furthermore, because of the amplification of mRNA, they could make vaccines, prototype vaccines, within a week of knowing the sequence and have that into patients a couple weeks later. So that's it's a small platform. It can be done with much less of a funding, a platform for funding, and it can be more rapid to licensure. I think that's the novelty. Whether the mRNA, it's certainly worked well with COVID, which has a single spike protein. It might work well with RSV and flu, which have two or some little bit different proteins. Will it work for complex diseases like malaria? Ugur said interested in thinking about malaria and tuberculosis being attacked with mRNA vaccines. And I think this challenge is right there to see if it will work or not. But I do think that the mRNA platform for some vaccines would be ideal and was much easier to mount. Bottom line though, and I think Amados mentioned this really well, is the human capacity of training people to work with mRNA technologies. It's not only the structural virology that needs to be found, but also use of the combination of lipids for the liposome that's made the different mRNA vaccines so different in, for instance, their cold sustainability. So I think we have a lot to do, but capacity building will be critical for this. And it's conceivable that we could use some of these new technologies to make these old-fashioned vaccines better and quicker. So there's a lot to learn here, but investing in those and the research capabilities is critical.
And if I can add something here to what Dr. Glass has just said, I think it's really there's so many synergies, I think. And I just pasted in the chat a paper which looks at what you can do with these 4 platforms and what else you could produce if you would actually go into the viral vector or the mRNA. What other regional vaccines could be researched upon and produced using this, because there's all these other sort of like endemic diseases that we have yet to find cures for. And the mRNA vaccine is also, I mean, mRNA technology, we could also use it for drugs beyond vaccines. So there are synergies, there are like extreme synergies, which we are yet to discover. And I think that this is where your session here, this seminar is so important, because you're trying to bring together the discussion on science and university R&D together with sort of production and markets. And so, yeah, I think we need more of this. The Africa CDC and the African Union has to organize much more of this, yes.
Yeah, and I think just drawing on your contributions, Dr. Glass and Dr. Sampath, one also needs to think about the ecosystem.
Yes.
I think that by default, we're drawn to the specifics of the science and the technology, and we say, do we have the capacity to do X or Y? But I think that triggered by this question about, okay, if we have the capacity, and it doesn't have to be COVID-19 vaccine only, but it could be any vaccine, that if you have the capacity and you've demonstrated the ability to make that vaccine at scale to the highest quality consistently, you are automatically now you will have established a good foundation to possibly move into making other vaccines. Not effortlessly, but certainly more easily than starting from scratch. And it's this ecosystem that I think one needs to appreciate, that it's not only the science, it's not only the factory, but it's the project management, it's the regulatory affairs, it's the finance, it's the commercial aspect, it's the logistics around this. And it's this whole thing coming together so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, as they say. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, but Rashi, perhaps this question is more geared to you, is there a specific role that Gavi and UNICEF ought to be playing? And I think you touched on this, but maybe you could focus on it a little bit more, expand upon it a little bit more, that Gavi and UNICEF could play in reshaping the market or assisting with reshaping the market to incentivize the establishment of local production in Africa?
Yeah. I mean, in the study and in the work that that we're doing, one of the things is, so we have the COVAX Manufacturing Task Force, but in work stream 3 of the COVAX Manufacturing Task Force right now is the mRNA hub, and I saw questions on the mRNA hub actually in the chat, which is being established in South Africa. But I think that Gavi, because it has the convening power right now, also through the COVAX facility, but also other vaccine supplies, can play a very big role in the future, exactly for the things we're discussing. So if we are going to actually incentivize local producers to use these technologies and to even produce new vaccines that we want to be supplied, introduction of these vaccines or signaling that these vaccines would be useful for introduction in protocols in conjunction with WHO and UNICEF, signaling the markets would be a very good starting point for local producers to start thinking about, if the COVID-19 vaccine market is going to be saturated, where are we going to move these investments? Where are the sort of like synergies? How can we sort of play around a little bit with the boundaries to occupy markets that are not fully occupied? In this study, I also make a comparison between birth cohort vaccines, for which actually right now we have enough supplies, but other vaccines where Gavi is procuring, and we have actually, not so many suppliers. For instance, take the case of measles. The Serum Institute of India is the sole supplier to Gavi. Take the case of yellow fever. We have much more demand than we have supply right now. So we have scope, really. We have scope to work with the current procurement system in Gavi to expand and to contribute. And Gavi is playing a good role in it. And I think to sort of expand this discussion on how Gavi could actively facilitate the entry of new firms from the African region across the spectrum, moving beyond just work stream 3 of the COVAX Manufacturing Task Force, I think the time is good for that. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. I know we have about 2 or 3 minutes left. Heba, are you connected and can you hear us? And I wondered whether you had any thoughts to any of the discussion points that we've covered in the last few minutes.
Yes, Patrick, did you hear me now? Because
yes,
I have, yeah, okay. I back to the last question related to the relation between, if I said UNICEF, Gavi, and the demand in the African market and the technology transfer. We had a little bit confused or not. I'm talking about the manufacturer, that now we need to enhance the capacity, to increase the capacity to fulfill the requirement for the vaccine need in the African countries. But we face a big challenge, which is the Gavi and UNICEF give the vaccine for the African countries with a very low price, and it is sometimes a donation. So the penetration to the African market should be through UNICEF. So we should register as UNICEF in the UNICEF tender in order to supply to the African countries. And the price at that time is very low. So it is, if we compare it with the investment is gonna to be added by the manufacturer for having a new facility, for increasing the capacity. So this point need to be studied very carefully. And that's why when we talk about having a hub facility and the initiative coming from Africa CDC, and which is securing, an African Union, which is securing this from, we are talking to have secure 60% of the vaccine need for the African country by 2040. So I agree that this should be studied very carefully to satisfy the needs for the continent from different type of vaccine. We are not talking only on COVID vaccine for the time being, but we talk about the different kind of vaccine. So back to your question, if can we use different kind of technology, and we, for example, nowadays, the messenger RNA vaccine, it is a new technology coming to the vaccine industry. So we should have feasibility for sustainability in the very near future for what kind of vaccine we need to add in order to have, we have a goal to achieve 60% for the continent need. So we need to collect all of that. And I think Africa CDC, they are working very hard now in order to make the policy, the strategy for having such a goal. So I think, Patrick, this point need to have more in-depth clarification and the contribution of UNICEF and Gavi for the African continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva. And Dr. Glass, I'm going to invite you to comment on a very provocative issue in 45 seconds, and that is,
Yes.
Dr. Collins touched on IP, intellectual property, and how important is intellectual property in terms of a gate to allowing manufacturers in developing countries to manufacture vaccines.
Thanks for the question, Patrick. I think it's a gate, but it's not the only gate. And when manufacturers are making vaccines, there's a lot of strategy and behind the scenes recipes that they put into the mix, not just the intellectual property. And knowing the intellectual property may not let you learn how to perhaps do the liposomes. You know what the lipids are, but you don't know how to put them together in the sauce and make up something that works. So I think the IP issues need to be worked out and be licensed or be shared. But beyond that, there is the secret sauce of making vaccines, which is where technology and manufacturing strategies comes to play.
Thank you, Dr. Glass. And thank you for stepping in and playing a tag team with Dr. Collins. It worked well. Thank you very much for your contribution. Padmasree, thank you so much for your time and perspectives on the complex issues of markets and market shaping and the interconnectedness with the technology and the also R&D. Dr. Wally, thank you for sharing your perspectives on the technology and the infrastructure and the connectedness with R&D as well, and your last point about the link to UNICEF and Gavi as well.